I'm Alexandra, 32, a woman, and for the last decade, my family has labeled me the official failure. Tonight, at the annual family dinner, an event I dreaded more than a root canal, I was about to watch that label shatter into a million pieces. The irony was, they would be the ones to hand me the hammer. The story of my failure in their eyes began 10 years ago. I was in my final year at a prestigious business school on the fast track to a comfortable, predictable, and respectable corporate life. My family, especially my Aunt Martha, was ecstatic. She had always seen me as being in direct competition with her daughter, my cousin Lee, who was a year younger than me. Martha's vision for our lives was a neat little race where her daughter was destined to win. My decision to drop out of that esteemed institution 3 months before graduation was, to her, the ultimate betrayal of my potential and, more importantly, a forfeit of the race she had manufactured in her mind. "You're throwing it all away, Alexandra," she had shrieked over the phone, her voice so sharp it could have cut glass. "For what? Some silly little idea about a computer program you'll be living in a box?" Lee, now she understands. She's already got a paid internship lined up at Stature Corp, a real company with a real future. Stature Corp was a mid-sized manufacturing company where her husband, my Uncle Carl, was a manager. It was their symbol of stability and success. To them, the world was simple. You get a degree from a good school, you get a safe job at a place like Stature Corp, you buy a sensible house, and you prove your worth with a steady, climbing salary. My path was an offensive deviation from this sacred blueprint. I tried to explain my vision. I had developed a groundbreaking algorithm for data analytics, a way for companies to understand their customers with unprecedented clarity. I called my fledgling company Aura Digital. I believed in it with every fiber of my being. "It's more than an idea, Aunt Martha," I had said, my voice full of a passion she could never comprehend. "It's the future." Her response was a derisive laugh. "The future doesn't pay rent, dear. Don't come crying to us when your little dream falls apart." And so the narrative was set. Alex, the foolish dreamer, Lee, the sensible achiever. For the next 10 years, every family gathering was a fresh performance of this play. The first few years were the hardest. I poured every penny I had and many I didn't into Aura Digital. I lived in a tiny, one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint and a temperamental heating system. My office was a second-hand desk crammed into the corner of my living room. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and an unshakable belief that I was onto something huge. Meanwhile, Lee, with her path smoothed by nepotism, climbed the ladder at Stature Corp. Each of her minor promotions was cause for a family-wide celebration, announced via mass email by a beaming Aunt Martha. I remember one particularly painful Christmas about 3 years in. I had just lost a major potential client and I was emotionally and financially drained. I showed up to my grandmother's house in a dress I'd owned since college because I couldn't afford a new one. Lee arrived in a brand new designer coat, a gift from her parents for her promotion to junior project manager. Aunt Martha made sure everyone noticed. "Feel the fabric," she'd insisted, grabbing my hand and forcing it onto the sleeve of Lee's coat. "That's what success feels like, Alexandra, maybe one day." She de-winked as if sharing a generous, hopeful secret, but her eyes were cold with pity. Later that evening, Uncle Carl cornered me by the fireplace. "You know, Alex," he'd said, swirling his brandy, "it's not too late to go back and finish that degree. Stature is always looking for people in marketing. I could probably get you an entry-level spot. It's not glorious, but it's a start, a real job." He thought he was being kind. That was the most insulting part. They didn't see my grueling work as a real job. They saw it as a hobby that had gone on for too long, a phase I refused to outgrow. My quiet insistence that Aura Digital was growing, that I was building a client base, was met with placating smiles and knowing glances. It was as if I were a child telling them about my imaginary friend. Another time, at a summer barbecue, the topic of vacations came up. Lee was gushing about her upcoming trip to Italy. Aunt Martha turned to me, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "And what about you, Alex? Any exciting trips planned, or is it just work, work, work in that little apartment of yours?" The implication was clear. Your life is small, confined, and joyless. I just smiled and said, "I'm reinvesting in the company right now. It's an exciting time." This was true. I had just hired my first 2 employees. But to them, it was just another excuse, another sign of my failure. Live a normal life. The only person who never treated me this way was my grandma Evelyn. She was the reason I subjected myself to these annual rituals of humiliation. In her quiet, unassuming way, she was my anchor. She never pretended to understand the complexities of data analytics or software development, but she understood passion. She'd squeeze my hand and whisper, "Don't you mind them, dear? The tallest trees grow slowly." Her unwavering faith was a silent, powerful counter-narrative to their loud, persistent scorn. And now here I was, 10 years after that fateful phone call, driving to Grandma Evelyn's house for the annual family dinner. But this year was different. Everything was different. The small, one-bedroom apartment was still my home, a fact they loved to mock, but it was no longer a sign of struggle. It was a choice. I liked its simplicity. It kept me grounded. The company that was once just a desk in my living room now occupied 3 floors of a downtown office building. Aura Digital had 200 employees and was a silent powerhouse in the tech industry, a name that made CEOs of Fortune 500 companies sit up and listen. And 2 days ago, after months of secret, intense negotiations, I had signed the final papers. Aura Digital had officially and very quietly acquired the financially floundering, debt-ridden Stature Corp. The company that was my family's gold standard of success now belonged to me. Aunt Martha, Uncle Carl, and Cousin Lee had a new unknown boss, and she was on her way to dinner. I took a deep breath as I pulled up to the curb. For 10 years, I had eaten their condescension and swallowed my pride. Tonight, they would be eating their words. I parked my modest sedan, another point of quiet ridicule for my family who equated worth with horsepower, and sat for a moment, the engine ticking as it cooled. The familiar dread was a cold knot in my stomach. I had faced down ruthless venture capitalists and skeptical corporate boards without flinching, yet the prospect of walking through my grandmother's front door made my palms sweat. It was the intimate nature of their judgment that made it so much more potent. It wasn't business, it was personal. Taking one last fortifying breath, I got out of the car. My grandmother's house was a cozy brick Tudor, nestled in a quiet, leafy suburb. It smelled of rose bushes and freshly cut grass, a scent that was usually comforting but tonight felt like the deceptive calm before a storm. Grandma Evelyn opened the door before I even had a chance to ring the bell, her face breaking into a warm, genuine smile that was the complete antidote to my anxiety. "Alexandra, my girl," she said, pulling me into a hug that smelled of cinnamon and love. "I'm so glad you're here." "I wouldn't miss it, Grandma," I said, hugging her back tightly. In her eyes, I wasn't a success or a failure, I was just her granddaughter. That unconditional acceptance was a rare gift in this family. As I stepped inside, the familiar cacophony of my family's chatter hit me. In the living room, the core members were assembled. Aunt Martha was holding court on the sofa, dressed in a sharp, tailored suit that screamed executive. Uncle Carl stood beside her, nodding along dutifully to whatever she was saying, and on the armchair, scrolling through her phone with an air of profound boredom, was my cousin Lee. She wore a dress that was likely worth more than my first 2 years of rent combined. "Alexandra, you made it," Aunt Martha called out, her voice a little too loud, ensuring all eyes turned to me. It wasn't a welcome, it was an announcement. The spectacle has arrived. "Hi, Aunt Martha, Uncle Carl, Lee," I said, my voice even and calm. I had learned years ago that any sign of defensiveness was blood in the water. "Good to see you, Alex," Uncle Carl said with a weak smile, already looking back to his wife for his next cue. Lee didn't look up from her phone, she just gave a little wave. "Hey, Alex." "Come, dear, have a seat," Aunt Martha said, patting the cushion next to her. "Tell us everything. What's new in your world?" The slight pause before the word world was a masterclass in subtle condescension, framing my life as some strange, alien planet far removed from their successful reality. "The usual," I replied, choosing to remain standing, working hard. Of course," Martha said, sharing a look with Carl. It was their bless her heart look. "Lee was just telling us about the new quarterly strategy she presented at Stature. They're projecting a 7% growth in her division. 7%? In this economy, her superiors are just blown away. They're already talking about her next promotion, aren't they, sweetie?" Lee finally looked up, a practiced, humble smile on her face. "It was a team effort, Mom, but yeah, it went really well. The VP of Global Operations said my presentation was the most insightful he's seen all year. We're just so PR. Ood, Uncle Carl chimed in, puffing out his chest. She's a real go-getter, got a good head on her shoulders, that one, knows how the real world works. The unspoken contrast hung in the air, unlike you, Alex. I just smiled. That's great, Lee. Congratulations. The politeness seemed to bother them more than an argument would. They wanted me to be bitter. They wanted me to be jealous. My placid demeanor denied them the satisfaction. Grandma Evelyn came to my rescue, emerging from the kitchen with a tray of appetizers. Leave the girl alone, Martha. She just got here. Alexandra, try one of these. I made them just for you. I took a cheese puff from the tray, my heart swelling with gratitude for my grandmother. She always knew. She saw the barbs and the passive aggression, and she was the only one who ever tried to deflect them. Aunt Martha sighed dramatically. Oh, Evelyn, I'm just making conversation. I care about my niece. I worry about her. It's a tough world out there when you're all on your own. No safety net, no 401k, no clear path forward. Every word was a carefully chosen jab. She was painting a picture of me as a reckless, struggling artist for the benefit of the other relatives who were beginning to arrive and fill the room. I could feel their eyes on me, a mixture of curiosity and the pity that Martha had so carefully cultivated for them over the years. I have a 401k, Aunt Martha, I said simply, taking a small bite of the appetizer. A very good one, actually. We have a great benefits package at my company. This threw her for a second. The script required me to be a destitute waif. My calm correction was an unwelcome ad-lib. Lee scoffed from her chair, finally deciding to fully engage. A benefits package? That's cute. Who's your provider? We use Blue Shield Global at Stature. Top of the line. I have a $0 copay on almost everything. She said it with the casual arrogance of someone who had never had to comparison shop for health insurance in her life. Ours is quite comprehensive, I said, refusing to be drawn into a battle of specifics. My employees are very happy with it. All three of them, Lee asked with a smirk. The last she had heard a few years ago, I had a handful of staff. The lie was so effortless for her. We have 200 now, actually, I replied, my tone as mild as if I were discussing the weather. A flicker of surprise crossed Lee's face before she quickly masked it. Uncle Carl shifted his weight uncomfortably. Aunt Martha, however, was a professional. She recovered instantly. 200, goodness, she exclaimed, her voice laden with feigned astonishment. Managing all those people in that tiny apartment of yours must be a real challenge. Do you have them work in shifts? The other relatives chuckled, and the knot in my stomach tightened. There it was, the inevitable condescending jab about my home. It was their favorite weapon. To them, my apartment wasn't just a place I lived. It was the ultimate symbol of my supposed failure. The fact that I hadn't upgraded to a house in the suburbs was proof that my little company was nothing more than a fantasy. I smiled, a real smile this time. It was starting, the final, predictable march towards their own demise. It's a wonderful apartment, I said. The view is fantastic. And it was. From my living room window, I had a clear, unobstructed view of the downtown skyline. A view that, funnily enough, prominently featured the headquarters of Stature Corp. Grandma Evelyn announced that dinner was ready, and we all migrated from the living room to the dining room. The table was beautifully set with her best china and silverware, a testament to her belief that even tense family gatherings deserved a touch of grace. I found my place card strategically positioned between a second cousin I barely knew and Grandma Evelyn, another small act of protection on her part. Aunt Martha, Uncle Carl, and Lee naturally sat together directly across from me, a unified front of judgment. As the food was passed around, a magnificent roast beef, creamy mashed potatoes, and crisp green beans, the conversation was immediately monopolized by my aunt. She operated with the subtlety of a sledgehammer, steering every topic back to the success and brilliance of her daughter and, by extension, the unimpeachable corporate wisdom of Stature Corp. You know, Martha began, addressing the table at large, Stature just landed a massive contract with an international distributor. It's going to be a game changer for the company. Lee was instrumental in putting together the pitch. Weren't you, dear? Lee, who was delicately cutting her roast beef, looked up with that same practiced modesty. I played a small part. My team did a lot of the heavy lifting, I just guided them. Oh, don't be so modest, Uncle Carl boomed. Her boss told me personally that the deal wouldn't have happened without her. He said she has executive. A potential executive. I focused on my plate, methodically buttering my dinner roll. I knew this performance well. It was designed to do two things: elevate Lee onto an impossibly high pedestal and simultaneously highlight the vast, pathetic valley where my own career supposedly languished. Speaking of business, Aunt Martha said, her eyes finally swiveling to land on me with theatrical precision. How are things with your project, Alexandra? Aura Digital, is it? She always said the name of my company as if she were trying to recall a dream she'd had a long time ago. Things are very well, thank you, I said, meeting her gaze. Is that so? She replied, her eyebrows raised in polite disbelief. Are you profitable yet? I know these little tech startups can burn through cash for years. It's such a volatile space. So risky. Not like a solid, dependable company like Stature. It's been a pillar of the community for 50 years. The irony was so thick I could have sliced it with my steak knife. A pillar of the community that had been quietly bleeding money for the last 5 years. A pillar that had taken on so much debt to mask its operational failures that it was on the verge of collapse. A pillar that I now owned. We're doing just fine, I said, offering no further details. My brevity was my shield. The less information I gave them, the less ammunition they had. Fine doesn't sound very inspiring, Lee chimed in, dabbing her lips with a napkin. In my division, if we just report that things are fine, we get called into a performance review. The expectation is excellent. But I guess it's different when you're only accountable to yourself. Her words were met with appreciative nods from her parents. To them, my autonomy wasn't a strength. It was a lack of oversight, a sign that I wasn't being held to any real standard. They couldn't comprehend the crushing weight of being accountable for the livelihoods of 200 employees. To them, I was just playing house in my little apartment. Uncle Carl leaned forward, adopting a tone of fatherly concern. Alex, it's admirable that you've stuck with it for so long, really, but there's no shame in admitting that something isn't working. Sometimes the smart move is knowing when to cut your losses. Stature Corp has a fantastic severance package, very generous. It gives people a soft landing when things don't pan out. He was talking about me, but he was also unknowingly talking about himself. Our acquisition plan for Stature Corp included a major restructuring of the executive team. His soft landing was coming sooner than he thought. I appreciate the advice, Uncle Carl, I said, but I've never been more confident in the path I'm on. My unwavering calm was starting to create tiny cracks in their smug facade. They were used to me being defensive or sullen. My serene confidence was a language they didn't speak. It was like I was playing chess while they were still setting up the checkers board. Frustrated by her husband's failed attempt, Aunt Martha decided to switch tactics from professional condescension to personal pity. It's just we worry, Alexandra, she said, her voice softening into a tone of deep, fraudulent sympathy. All your friends are getting married, buying houses, having children, and you're still in that same little apartment. It's a fine place for a student for someone starting out, but it's been 10 years. Don't you want more? A real home, a garden. The word home was the key. She was implying that my life was transient, temporary, and incomplete, that my apartment was just a waiting room for a life that had never begun. I'm happy where I am, I stated plainly. It's home. But for how long? Lee pushed, unable to resist joining the attack. Aren't you worried about rent increases? In this market, at Stature, they offer us assistance programs for home buying. It's part of the benefits of working for a company that invests in its people's long-term stability. Every sentence was a perfectly crafted insult, wrapped in the guise of corporate benevolence. They were building their case against me brick by brick for the benefit of the entire dinner table. They were methodically proving to everyone that I was a lost cause, a cautionary tale, and I just let them. I watched as they laid the foundation for their own humiliation, completely unaware of the beautiful karmic trap they were setting for themselves. My grandmother, sensing the escalating tension, tried to intervene. "The roast is delicious, isn't it?" she said brightly. "Alexandra, did you know the recipe was your great-grandmother's?" But Aunt Martha was relentless. She was a dog with a bone, and she was not about to be distracted by family history. She saw an opening, a moment of perceived weakness, and she was going for the kill. She was determined to break me tonight, to finally force me to concede that her vision of the world was HT and mine was wrong. She had no idea that I was just waiting for the perfect moment to let her win, just for a second, before she lost everything. The air in the dining room grew thick and heavy. The clinking of cutlery on china was the only sound that occasionally punctuated the suffocating silence that followed each of their verbal jabs. Most of the other relatives stared intently at their plates, clearly uncomfortable but too intimidated by Aunt Martha to intervene. My grandmother shot me a look of profound apology from across the table, and I gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod to signal that I was okay. I was more than okay. I was a coiled spring. Aunt Martha, sensing she had me cornered, leaned back in her chair with a sigh of theatrical exasperation. "I just don't understand it, Alexandra," she said, shaking her head slowly. "You're such a bright girl, you had so much potential, to see it all just fizzle out. It's a shame, it truly is." The word fizzle stung more than she could know. It was the perfect description of what she thought my life was, a firework that had failed to launch, just a sad puff of smoke on the ground. She didn't see the years of burning the midnight oil, the sacrifices, the relentless pressure, the white-hot fire of ambition that had forged Aura Digital into what it was. She just saw the unlit fuse. Uncle Carl nodded in solemn agreement. "Martha's right, Alex. We're family, we're supposed to be honest with each other, and honestly, it's hard to watch. We see Lee thriving, building a real career, making a name for herself, and then we see you." He trailed off, letting the unspoken comparison do the heavy lifting. "And then we see you going nowhere." This was it, the grand finale of their decade-long performance. They had set the stage, delivered their monologues, and now it was time for the final, crushing line. It was Lee who delivered it, and she did so with the callous, effortless cruelty of someone who had never been told no in her life. She put her fork down, looked me directly in the eye, and with a smirk that was pure, distilled condescension, she asked the question. The one they had been circling all night. The one they felt was their ultimate trump card. "Seriously, Alex," she said, her voice laced with a mocking pity that was worse than any shout. "Forget all the business talk, just tell me, are you still living in that apartment?" The table went silent, not a polite, awkward silence, but a sharp, absolute void of sound. The question hung in the air, ugly and exposed. It wasn't just a question about my living situation, it was a summary of their entire judgment of me. It meant, are you still small? Are you still struggling? Are you still clinging to that pathetic little life while the rest of us have moved on? Have you made no progress at all? Aunt Martha and Uncle Carl couldn't contain themselves. A low chuckle rumbled from Uncle Carl's chest, and Aunt Martha covered her mouth with her hand, but her eyes were gleaming with malicious delight. They had done it. They had landed the perfect blow. In their minds, there was no good answer for me. If I said yes, I confirmed their narrative of my failure. If I got angry, I was proving them right. They thought they had checkmated me. I looked at Lee. I looked at her smug, triumphant face, the face of a person who believed she had won. I looked at my aunt and uncle, basking in the secondhand glory of their daughter's cruelty. I saw their years of doubt, their derision, their pity. I felt the sting of every single condescending comment, every backhanded compliment, every feigned expression of concern from the last 10 years. They all coalesced into that one ugly question. And then I felt a profound sense of calm wash over me. The knot of dread in my stomach that had been there for hours finally dissolved. It was replaced by a cool, clear certainty. The moment I had been waiting for, the moment I had been working towards, had finally arrived, and it was so much sweeter than I had ever imagined. I didn't flush with anger or embarrassment. I didn't stammer or look away. Instead, I let the silence stretch out for a few more seconds, forcing them to sit with the ugliness of what had just been said. I let the other family members squirm in their seats. I held Lee's gaze, my expression unreadable. And then I smiled. It wasn't a big smile, it was a small, quiet, knowing curve of my lips. It was the most genuine smile they had seen from me in a decade. It was a smile that held 10 years of secret work, of silent struggle, and of ultimate victory. It was a smile they could not possibly comprehend. The sight of it wiped the smirk clean off Lee's face. It made my aunt's triumphant gleam falter. They expected tears or anger. They had no idea how to react to my peace. I picked up my water glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and placed it back on the table with a soft click. I let my eyes drift from Lee to her mother and then to her father. I held them all in my calm, steady gaze. And then, in a voice that was perfectly even, perfectly clear, and just loud enough for everyone at the table to hear, I answered her question. That apartment, I began, letting the question hang in the air for a moment as if I were genuinely considering it. I tilted my head slightly, my smile remaining fixed. Yes, Lee, I am still living in that apartment. I find it very convenient. I paused, letting them absorb what they believed was my concession. Aunt Martha's triumphant expression returned. Lee's smirk started to reappear. They thought this was it, the pathetic admission they had been seeking all night. It has a fantastic view of the city, I continued, my voice still light and conversational. Especially of the Stature Corp headquarters building. I can see right into the executive offices from my living room window, you know, the ones on the top floor. A faint line appeared between Aunt Martha's eyebrows. This was an odd, unexpected detail. It wasn't part of the script. Uncle Carl shifted in his seat. I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table, creating an atmosphere of intimacy, as if I were about to share a delicious secret. You're right, though, I said, looking directly at my aunt and uncle. It has been a pillar of the community for 50 years. Stature Corp, I mean, a solid, dependable company. I repeated their own words back to them. But pillars can crumble, especially when they're built on a foundation of debt and outdated practices. The color began to drain from Uncle Carl's face. He worked in the upper echelons of the company. He knew about the financials. He knew the truth behind the brave face the company presented to the public. Aunt Martha's expression hardened. What are you talking about, Alexandra? I'm talking about the international distribution contract you mentioned earlier, I said, turning my attention back to Lee. The one that was going to be a game changer. It was too little, too late. The company was already insolvent. That deal wasn't a life raft. It was just a final, desperate gasp for air before the water closed over its head. That's ridiculous, Lee stammered, her composure finally cracking. You don't know what you're talking about. We're stronger than ever. Are you? I asked gently. I let the question sit there for a beat. The entire table was frozen, a tableau of shock and confusion. The second cousins, the distant relatives, they were all leaning in now, their forgotten dinners growing cold on their plates. They were watching the family's established narrative unravel in real time. And then I delivered the final, devastating blow. I did it without raising my voice, without a hint of malice. I did it with the simple, unassailable power of the truth. I smiled and said, I know all of this because my company, Aura Digital, has spent the last 3 months conducting a thorough and aggressive due diligence process on Stature Corp. That process concluded this past Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. when I signed the final documents. I looked from Aunt Martha's paling face to Uncle Carl's gaping mouth to Lee's wide, terrified eyes. I let them connect the dots. I gave them a moment to arrive at the conclusion themselves before I spelled it out for them. Then I finished the thought they were all having. I'm still living in that apartment, I said, my voice soft but clear as a bell. Because as the new owner and CEO of Stature Corporation, I found out the acquisition was closing this week, and frankly, I've been far too busy to go house hunting. The table went silent. It was a silence unlike any I had ever experienced. It was not empty, it was dense, heavy, and absolute. It was the sound of a world turning upside down. It was the sound of 10 years of mockery and condescension crashing into an immovable wall of fact. Aunt Martha's jaw was slack, her carefully applied lipstick suddenly looking garish against her now ashen skin. Uncle Carl looked like he had been punched in the gut. All the air had gone out of him, leaving a deflated, shocked husk. But the most profound reaction came from Lee. The arrogance, the smirk, the casual cruelty, it all vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated horror. Her face, which had been alight with smug satisfaction just moments before, was now a mask of dawning comprehension. The failure, the cautionary tale, the cousin she had pitied and mocked for a decade, was now her boss. The woman whose life she had just publicly ridiculed now held her entire career, her real job at her real company, in the palm of her hand. In that deafening silence, my gaze drifted across the table to my grandmother. She wasn't shocked. Her eyes were shining with tears, and on her face was a look of the most profound, radiant pride I had ever seen. She lifted her water glass in a small, trembling, almost imperceptible toa. And in that moment, I knew that her quiet, unwavering belief had been the only validation I had ever really needed. The hammer had fallen, the label was shattered, and the silence was the most beautiful sound in the world. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. It was finally broken by a strange, strangled sound from Uncle Carl. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, like a fish out of water, before finally managing to speak. That's not possible," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "There were rumors of an acquisition, but a tech firm, a company like yours, no, the board would never approve it." He was in denial, desperately clinging to the established world order where manufacturing giants weren't bought by software startups run by his failure of a niece. "The board didn't have a choice, Uncle Carl," I explained calmly. Stature was leveraged to the hilt. They were days away from defaulting on their loans. The alternative to my offer wasn't a different buyer, it was bankruptcy and total liquidation. My offer to absorb the company's debt and keep the brand alive was the only viable path forward. It was approved unanimously by the board and the primary creditors yesterday afternoon. The public announcement is scheduled for Monday morning. I laid out the facts like stones in a path, each one solid and immovable, leading them to a reality they could not escape. Aunt Martha finally found her voice. It was shrill, laced with disbelief and a rising panic. "You're lying," she accused, pointing a trembling finger at me. "This is some kind of sick joke, Alexandra, to get back at us for trying to help you, to guide you." "Help me?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Is that what you call it? For 10 years, you have used every opportunity to ridicule me, to belittle my work, and to paint me as a failure in front of anyone who would listen. You didn't offer guidance, you offered scorn, and I'm not joking. Check your work email. You should have a notification from HR about a mandatory, all-hands town hall meeting on Monday at 10 a.m. to be led by the new CEO. Lee fumbled for her phone on the table, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. Her face was illuminated by the screen as she frantically scrolled through her inbox. The blood drained from her face, leaving her looking pale and sick. She looked up from her phone, her eyes wide with terror. She didn't have to say a word. Her expression confirmed everything. The rest of the table was in an uproar. Cousins were whispering furiously to each other. Distant aunts and uncles were staring at me with a newfound, almost fearful respect. The entire power dynamic of the family had been redrawn in the space of a single sentence. I was no longer Alex, the pitiable dreamer. I was Alexandra, the CEO. Aunt Martha's panic began to curdle into a desperate, fawning plea. The speed of the transformation was nauseating. "Alexandra, sweetie," she began, her voice suddenly syrupy sweet. We didn't mean any of it. It was just teasing. You know how families are. We were just trying to motivate you. We always knew you had it in you. We were just pushing you to be your best self." It was the most pathetic, transparent lie I had ever heard. "You weren't pushing me, Aunt Martha," I said, my voice firm, cutting through her desperate babble. "You were trying to break me. There's a difference." Uncle Carl, finally grasping the full catastrophic implications of the situation for his own career, tried a different approach. He attempted to regain some semblance of authority. Now listen here, Alex, he started, trying to inject a stern, fatherly tone into his voice. Business is business and family is family. You can't let a little family squabble affect professional decisions. I've given 25 years of my life to that company. And as the vice president of sales, I countered, my tone becoming steely, you presided over a department that has missed its revenue targets for 8 consecutive quarters, all while your own expense reports showed a remarkable increase in client entertainment. As I said, business is business. On Monday, my new COO and I will begin a full review of all executive-level performance and spending. Everything will be on the table. The threat was clear, and it landed with the force of a physical blow. He slumped back in his chair, utterly defeated. The dinner was, for all intents and purposes, over. No one touched their food. The festive atmosphere had evaporated, replaced by a thick fog of tension and humiliation. Lee started to cry, silent tears tracking through her expensive makeup as she stared at me with a look of utter desolation. It was the first time I had ever seen her look truly vulnerable, stripped of the armor of her parents' praise and her own arrogance. I felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a profound sadness for the person she might have been if she hadn't been. Raised to believe that the only way to shine was to dim the light of others. My grandmother rose slowly from her chair. I think, she said, her voice full of a quiet authority that commanded the room, that it's time for dessert in the living room. It was a clear dismissal, an escape hatch for everyone to flee the wreckage at the dinner table. There was a clumsy, scraping sound of chairs as everyone quickly stood up, eager to escape the unbearable atmosphere. No one made eye contact with me or with my aunt, uncle, and cousin. They were radioactive, and no one wanted to be caught in the fallout. As they all filed out, Aunt Martha, Uncle Carl, and Leigh remained frozen at the table, a portrait of a dynasty that had just crumbled to dust. In the quiet aftermath, as the rest of the family made their hasty retreat to the living room, I stood up from the table. I walked around to where my grandmother was standing and gently took her hand. "Let's get some air," I whispered. She squeezed my hand and nodded, her eyes still shining. We slipped out the back door into the cool night air of her garden. For a few moments, we just stood there in silence, listening to the chirping of crickets and the distant murmur of conversation from inside the house. "I am so proud of you, Alexandra," she finally said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not because of the money or the company, but because you never let them poison your spirit. You built your own success on your own terms. That's a strength they will never understand." "I couldn't have done it without you, Grandma," I said, and I meant it. "You were the only one who ever believed in me." "I believed in your heart, dear," she replied, patting my hand. "The rest was all you." We stood there for a while longer, and I felt the last 10 years of bitterness and resentment begin to wash away, replaced by a clean, quiet sense of peace. The victory wasn't in their humiliation, it was in my own liberation from their judgment. Their opinions, which had once felt like a heavy anchor, were now just noise in the distance. Eventually, I made my excuses and left the party. There were no dramatic goodbyes. My aunt, uncle, and cousin were still huddled in the dining room when I left, speaking in low, frantic whispers. They didn't look up as I walked past. The drive back to my apartment was surreal. My phone, which I had put on silent for the dinner, was buzzing incessantly in my purse. I knew without looking that it would be a flood of panicked texts and missed calls from the 3 people who, just a few hours ago, couldn't have been more dismissive of me. When I got home, I walked through my small, familiar apartment, the apartment they had scorned. I went to the large picture window in my living room and looked out at the glittering city skyline. There it was, the Stature Corp building, dark and silent, my building. I finally pulled out my phone. There were 15 missed calls from Aunt Martha and a string of increasingly desperate texts from Lee. "Lee, Alex, we need to talk." "Lee, please call me. It was all a misunderstanding." "Lee, I'm so sorry. I was just repeating what Mom and Dad always say. Please don't fire me." Her apology, born of fear, meant nothing. The true apology would have been to see my worth when I had nothing to offer her. I ignored the messages and instead I opened my laptop. There was an email from my COO with the subject line, Monday's Agenda. I opened it and began to work, a sense of calm purpose settling over me. I had a company to run, two companies in fact. I had 200 employees at Aura Digital who depended on me, and now thousands more at Stature Corp who were looking to me for a future. My personal feelings about my relatives were irrelevant to my professional responsibilities. I wouldn't fire Lee or my uncle out of spite. That would make me no better than them. They would be evaluated like every other employee based on their performance, their contributions, and their attitude. Their future at my company would be a direct result of their own actions, not my personal vengeance. For the first time, they would have to earn their place in the world without the safety net of nepotism and arrogance. That, I realized, was the most fitting justice of all. I looked around my apartment, the place they saw as a symbol of my failure. To me, it was a monument to my success. Every square inch was paid for with the profits of a dream they said was impossible. This wasn't a waiting room for my life, this was the command center where my life was built. And for the first time in a long time, I felt truly, completely at home. To anyone out there who is listening to my story, to anyone who has ever been made to feel small or been told that your dream is foolish, I want you to hear this. Don't let the noise of other people's opinions drown out your own inner voice. Their definition of success doesn't have to be yours. Build your own pillar, truths. Tea in your own vision, even when no one else does. The satisfaction of proving yourself right on your own terms is a victory that no one can ever take away from you.